Hello, my name is Alex Isles, and in today's episode we're going to be speaking about Robert the Bruce. Welcome back. Scotland has no shortage of legends and heroes, but few are as prominent as Robert the Bruce. The king, the warrior, and the man who refused to accept defeat. He went from a nobleman to being a fugitive, to the ruler who finally secured Scottish independence. His story is one of betrayal, rebellion, and some of the most dramatic battles in medieval history, culminating in one of the most famous victories of the medieval period at Bannockburn. Was Robert the Bruce a true Scottish patriot fighting for his people's freedom, or just another ambitious Norman noble looking out for his own interests? And what about the famous story of him taking inspiration from a spider? Let's dive into the life of Scotland's most tenacious king, a man who turned the tides of history and ensured his name would never be forgotten. To set the scene for Robert the Bruce, you need to go back to Normandy. The family was said to have come across to England following Henry I's campaigns in Normandy, and were granted lands in both Scotland, the lands of Annandale, and in Skelton, now Redcar in Cleveland, which is why I sometimes say to people that Robert the Bruce was a Norman with a Yorkshire accent pretending to be a Scot. As you can imagine, this goes down like a lead balloon, and it's entirely tongue-in-cheek, but it's a good conversation starter when someone just takes nationalist rhetoric at face value. The de Bruces, having come from Normandy, began settling and expanding their control in Yorkshire, founding Gisborough Priory and beginning to build their holdings. Now, when it comes to these noble families, one thing you have to take into account is that once they found a name, they really stuck with it. So there's actually quite a few Robert the Bruces. So I'll do my best to number them so that this doesn't get too confusing. The first Robert the Bruce lived from 1078 till 1141, and he was a great friend of King David I of Scotland, and was granted the lordship of Annandale. But during the anarchy, which was a conflict between Henry I's daughter, Matilda, who was the rightful Queen of England, fight me on this one, and her cousin Stephen, Robert the Bruce sided against his friend David, as David had invaded northern England, taking both Northumberland and Cumbria back into Scotland. And so, because of this, Robert the Bruce, first Bruce, he was actually a part of the English forces against King David, along with his oldest son Adam, while his second son, Robert II Bruce, fought for David, hence becoming the second Lord of Annandale, as the family's holdings split, with the English and Scottish branches taking different holdings, but both sides would be buried at Gisborough Priory for centuries to come. The third de Bruce, William, was granted lands in northern England again, while the fourth de Bruce married Isabella of Huntingdon, the second daughter of David of Scotland, the 8th Earl of Huntingdon, a title connected to Northumbrian history, as the last Anglo-Saxon Earls of Northumbria were granted Huntingdon, and it requires an entire episode in itself. David of Scotland was the great-grandson of David I of Scotland's son Henry, the 3rd Earl of Northumberland and 3rd Earl of Huntingdon, and it was through him that the Bruces would be related to Henry I of England and also William the Conqueror, so you can see the family tree had a fair bit of royal blood and controversial figures in it already. This meant that Robert de Bruce V was able to claim the title of King of Scots, but we're already getting ahead of ourselves. The fifth Robert de Bruce was Bruce's grandfather. He married Isabella of Gloucester, granddaughter of William Marshal, meaning that Robert the Bruce, the seventh Robert the Bruce, our Robert the Bruce, was the great-great-grandson of the man who is considered to be the greatest English knight. Bruce VI was very fortunate. He was on the side of Henry III of England during the Second Barons' Revolt, gaining many lands for his family in Northumberland and in Yorkshire, as well as in Bedfordshire as well, and then joined the future Edward I on crusade. He married Marjorie, Countess of Carrick, and in doing so strengthened the family's holdings in southern Scotland and Scottish claims for his children. The stage was set. Now that we have all of that genealogy out of the way, we can talk about Robert de Bruce, the seventh Bruce, himself. Robert was born on the 11th of July, 1274, and his place of birth isn't known for certain, but some historians believe that he was likely born in Turnberry Castle in Ayrshire, the principal seat of his mother's earldom. We have very little information about Robert's youth, but there are hints that he was fostered in Argyllshire, exposing him to Gaelic culture, and he would have been familiar with the Anglo-Norman culture of England as well. He remained an integral part of maintaining Gaelic-speaking culture. With this background, he spoke Anglo-Norman French, Gaelic and Latin, as well as having an upbringing of a young noble of the period. Due to the importance of the chivalric code, it's likely that Robert's chief tutor was a reputable, experienced knight drawn from his own father's crusading retinue. It's also likely that Robert and his brother Edward, from the age of 12, began training for full knighthood. They would have been fostered with an allied family, possibly in Argyllshire, and then maybe later on with the De Clares of Gloucester, perhaps even the English royal household as well, as we have evidence from Sir Thomas Gray, who tells us that in 1292 Robert, aged 18, was a young bachelor of King Edward's chamber. As his father had been on crusade with Edward, this personal connection would have enabled for this position. Robert appears first in history on a witness list of a charter issued by Alexander MacDonald. He is listed in the company of the Bishop of Argyll, alongside his father and a host of Gaelic notaries from Carrick. Robert was then 16 years of age when Margaret, Maid of Norway, died in 1290. It's also around this time that Robert would have been knighted, and he begins to appear on the political stage in the Bruce's dynastic interests. It's at this time we start looking at the Great Cause. The Great Cause would shape Scottish history for centuries to come. It started when the crown of Scotland became vacant after the death of King Alexander III, leaving his 3-year-old granddaughter as Margaret as his heir. In September of 1290, the young Margaret died herself at 7 years old, and I've done an entire episode on this, which you can find here on the channel. Anyway, a quick summary. 13 claimants came forward to claim the throne. Balliol had asked Edward I of England to arbitrate who would be the next King of Scots, and Edward I claimed, obviously, that they were his subjects. Now, Robert's grandfather lost out to John Balliol, who became the next King of Scots. The Bruces weren't exactly thrilled about this outcome, as their rivalry with the Balliol family would shape much of Robert's early life. John then ruled as King of Scots until 1296, when he was replaced by Robert the Bruce. But we're jumping ahead of ourselves, let's get into some detail. After John's accession, Edward continued to assert his authority over Scotland, and relationships between the two kings deteriorated pretty quickly. Scottish nobles simply saw him as a puppet for Edward I. The Bruces sided with King Edward against King John and his allies. This might surprise some of you that Robert the Bruce started off as a noble vassal of Edward I, but Robert the Bruce and his father both considered John Balliol as a usurper against their claim, hence why they supported the English king against the Scottish. The straw that really broke the camel's back in the relationship between the two kings, though, was when Edward demanded that Scottish magnates provide military service in England's war against France. This was completely unacceptable to the Scots nobility, and instead many decided to ally with France to resist the English crown. Due to the fact that the Bruces were supporting Edward, they decided to leave Scotland entirely, and they were granted safe passage into England at Carlisle, where they were the governors of Carlisle Castle during this period. At some point in 1296, Robert married his first wife, Isabella of Mar, the daughter of Domnall, 1st Earl of Mar, part of northeastern Scotland. Isabella died shortly after their marriage, most likely during the birth of their first child, Marjorie Bruce. The first blow in the wars between England and Scotland would be a direct attack on the Bruces. On the 26th of March 1296, after having attacked the Bruces' estates back in Scotland, several Scottish earls made a surprise attack on the walled city of Carlisle, deliberately chosen not just as an attack on England, but also as a direct attack on the Bruces. Both Robert's grandfather and father had at one time been governors of the castle, and it remained one of their principal residences. The next time Carlisle Castle would be attacked, it would be in 1315, and Robert would be leading the attack. So it's amazing to see how the tables would have turned. Edward's response to King John's alliance with France and the attack on Carlisle Castle was immediately invading Scotland at the end of March in 1296, and by taking the town of Berwick on his way. At the Battle of Dunbar, Scottish resistance was effectively crushed, and Edward deposed King John Balliol and placed him in a Tower of London, with the Scots having to foot the bill for his imprisonment, and installed his knights and lords and servants to govern Scotland. With the Bruces now back in possession of Annandale and Carrick in August of 1296, Robert and his father were amongst more than 1,500 Scots at Berwick who swore an oath to King Edward I of England. This would not hold the peace for long, and discontent was brewing. When the Scottish revolt broke out against Edward in 1297, James Stuart, the 5th High Steward of Scotland, led it. It would be his dynasty who would eventually unite England and Scotland as a single nation. James led a rebellion with a group of dissatisfied Scots, including the young Robert the Bruce. Ambitious as always, Bruce now saw it as his time. The future king was now 22 years old and joined the rebels. Switching sides was practically a medieval pastime. His father, on the other hand, took no part in the rebellion and appears to have abandoned Annandale once again for the safety of Carlisle. Scotland was now in full rebellion, led by none other than William Wallace, who we'll cover in another episode. Bruce was initially torn between his loyalties, was ultimately a part of the resistance, though he acted more like a political opportunist than a freedom fighter. Eventually, the rebellion was suppressed through a treaty called the Capitulation of Irvine, in which the Scottish lords did not have to serve beyond the sea against their will, and were pardoned for their recent violence in return for swearing allegiance to King Edward. After William Wallace was beaten at the Battle of Falkirk, he was succeeded by Robert the Bruce as Guardian of Scotland. The Guardians of Scotland were the regents to govern the Kingdom of Scotland from 1286 until 1292, and then from 1296 until 1306. William Wallace, while successful as a war leader, was captured and hung, drawn and quartered, and his body was displayed across England and Scotland. This was an important statement, as this was the death of a traitor, and it stated that Wallace was Edward's subject to those who viewed his remains. A little bit of local history: Newcastle, where I live, received his right leg, and according to some sources his genitals were hung from the side of Newcastle's castle. Another Scottish lord, John Comyn, became joint guardian with Robert. However, they could not see past their personal differences. Comyn was also a threat to Robert, as he was one of the supporters of King John and was also his nephew, which granted him a serious claim to the Scottish throne, and so the rivalry between Comyn and Robert was set. Bruce, much like the rest of his family, had a complete belief in his right to the Scottish throne. With John Comyn in the picture, who was a supporter of John Balliol, this was a serious threat, especially considering that Comyn was the most powerful noble in Scotland, who had relatives on both sides of the border. Comyn was the nephew of John Balliol, as well as being descended from Donald III on his father's side and David I on his mother's side, so he had a pretty good chance to be the next in line for the throne. In a secret agreement sworn, signed and sealed, John Comyn agreed to forfeit his claim to the Scottish throne in favour of Robert the Bruce upon receipt of the Bruce's lands in Scotland, should an uprising occur led by Bruce. Whether the details of this agreement with Comyn are correct or not, King Edward moved to arrest Bruce while Bruce was still at the English court. Ralph de Mortimer, Edward I's own son-in-law, learned Edward's intention and warned Bruce by sending him 12 pence and a pair of spurs. Bruce took the hint, and he and his squire fled the English court during the night. They made their way quickly for Scotland. Bruce finally snapped. Comyn had betrayed his agreement with Bruce, and when Bruce arranged a meeting for Comyn in the chapel of Greyfriars Monastery in Dumfries, he accused him of treachery and they came to blows. Bruce stabbed Comyn before the high altar in Dumfries in 1306. However, there are conflicting reports. Some say Robert drew his sword and struck Comyn over the head, and then Bruce's supporters finished Comyn off by stabbing him to death. Others say Comyn survived Bruce's stabbing, and when finding out that he had survived, 2 of Bruce's supporters went back inside and made sure he was dead by finishing Bruce's work. Bruce and his party then attacked Dumfries Castle, where the English garrison surrendered. Bruce quickly hurried from Dumfries to Glasgow, where his friend and supporter Bishop Robert Wishart granted him absolution and subsequently called the clergy throughout the land to rally to Bruce. In medieval Europe, killing a political rival was frowned upon, but it was understood as a part of what would happen within the life of kings. But doing it inside a church? That is how you get excommunicated, and that's exactly what happened to Robert the Bruce. With Comyn dead, there was no turning back. Robert had fully committed himself to the Scottish cause, whether Scotland wanted him or not. Less than 7 weeks after the murder, he was crowned King of Scots at Scone on the 25th of March, 1306. However, the ceremony lacked the grandeur it should have had. The Stone of Destiny, the ancient coronation stone of Scottish kings, was conveniently sitting in Westminster Abbey. Interestingly enough, some people think it could even be a block of Roman masonry, which adds a whole new level, but further archaeological research needs to be done. The Earl of Fife himself, the traditional kingmaker of the Kings of Scots, refused to attend, and it was none other than Isabella Countess of Buchan, John Comyn's widow and the Earl of Fife's daughter, who stepped up, defying her own family's loyalty to the Coms to crown Bruce herself. Maybe it was slightly pragmatic, as it's hard to be loyal to a corpse, but she may have been slightly conflicted all the same. Edward I, furious at Bruce's sudden rebellion, wasted no time. He sent his commander, Aymer de Valence, 2nd Earl of Pembroke, to deal with the so-called king. Bruce, now branded as both a murderer and a usurper, suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Methven in 1306, where his army was ambushed while they were still half asleep. He barely escaped with his own life, and things only got worse. His brothers Nigel, Thomas and Alexander were captured and brutally executed, with only his brother Edward surviving, while his wife, daughter and sister were taken prisoner. His sister famously ended up in Newcastle's castle, and I've actually got a whole episode where you can see the room where she spent many years as a captive. With everything lost, Robert fled into the wilderness. This is where the spider story supposedly comes in. Hiding in a cave, he watched as a spider repeatedly attempted to spin its web, despite failure after failure. Inspired by its persistence, Bruce decided he too would keep fighting. Whether or not the story is true, one thing is certain: Robert the Bruce wasn't done yet. Bruce did not return with overwhelming force. Instead, he used intelligence and guerrilla tactics. His knowledge of Scotland's rugged terrain allowed him to launch ambushes, strike key outposts, and evade English forces attempting to capture him. His men became experts in fast attacks, disappearing into the Highlands before their enemies could even react. In 1307, the tide began to turn in Bruce's favour. Edward I, the formidable Hammer of the Scots, died in Borough-by-Sands while making his way north, leaving his son, Edward II, in charge. Unlike his father, Edward II lacked military prowess and was more concerned with internal disputes amongst his own nobility than with Scottish affairs. Bruce took advantage of this weakness, retaking key Scottish strongholds and castles. His forces used scorched earth tactics, destroying English supply lines and forcing their garrisons into isolated pockets of resistance. One of the key policies of Bruce was to slight castles. A recent master's dissertation by Philippa Johnson at Aberdeen University in 2024 covers how Bruce strategically damaged castles to reduce English control, increasing their cost and hampering revenue gathering in Scotland, while maintaining key castles which enabled his war efforts, such as Aberdeen and Dundee. It also undermined lords, as castles were also great stately homes, taking away their authority and warning them of what Bruce was willing to do. This slighting had a significant impact on local populations, and Dr. Murray Cook of Stirling Archaeology states that Stirling saw a 60% drop in its economy due to Bruce's actions. I'm sure that some Scots felt that the cure was as bad as the disease. By 1309, Bruce was recognised as the de facto ruler of Scotland. He held his first parliament at St Andrews, securing pledges of loyalty from many Scottish nobles who had previously hesitated to support him. The English, however, still controlled key strategic locations, including Stirling Castle, the last major English stronghold in Scotland. If Bruce were to secure full independence, he needed one decisive victory. That moment came in June 1314 at the Battle of Bannockburn. Outnumbered nearly 2-1, Bruce's forces faced off against the mighty English army led by Edward II. The battle began with Bruce himself famously slaying the English knight Henry de Bohun in a daredevil charge where he, only armed with an axe, took on Henry with a lance, manoeuvring at the last second to dodge the lance, standing up in his stirrups and bringing his axe down on the knight's head, breaking the shaft of his axe but cleaving Henry's helmet, skull and brain in single combat, setting the tone for the Scots' resistance. Over 2 days of brutal fighting, Bruce's army used superior positioning and tactical formations of sciatrons where densely packed pikes were lethal to English knights, crushed the English, forcing Edward II to flee. Bannockburn was not just a military triumph, it was a symbol of Scottish defiance. From that moment forward, Scotland's independence was all but assured. Alongside this, Dr. Murray Cook of Stirling Archaeology is doing further investigation into the battlefield and the camps where the Scots stayed beforehand. So if you find him on Substack, you can really enjoy some of the excavations and current archaeology being done on these famous battle sites. Following Bannockburn, Bruce launched devastating raids into northern England, burning towns and plundering resources. These incursions were meant to keep the English off balance and force them to negotiate. His forces also invaded Ireland in 1315, attempting to open a second front against the English, though this campaign ultimately faltered and never succeeded in its aim of placing his brother on the throne of Ireland. Nevertheless, Bruce's rule was now secure, and his next focus was on diplomatic recognition of Scotland's independence. After Bannockburn, Bruce continued to strengthen Scotland's independence, and not just through warfare but also through diplomacy and statecraft. He knew that a lasting peace with England required international support. In 1320, Scottish nobles signed the Declaration of Arbroath, a groundbreaking letter to the Pope asserting Scotland's right to national sovereignty. This document is considered by some to be an inspiration for the US Declaration of Independence, boldly stated that Scotland's kings ruled by the will of the people, not by the authority of England. The Declaration of Arbroath had a profound impact. Though the Pope initially sided with England, Bruce's persistence paid off, and by 1324, Pope John XXII formally recognised Bruce as the rightful King of Scots. This was a crucial victory as it gave Bruce international legitimacy and further isolated England diplomatically. Meanwhile, Bruce worked tirelessly to secure Scotland's economy and military. He introduced land reforms, redistributing confiscated estates from pro-English nobles to his loyal supporters, always a good way to secure your position after becoming king. He also strengthened Scotland's naval capacities, recognising that control of the seas was essential in defending against future invasions. He encouraged trade with France and Flanders, ensuring that Scotland would not be economically dependent on England. In 1327, Edward II was deposed by his own barons and was replaced by his teenage son Edward III. This provided Bruce with an opportunity to negotiate peace. In 1328, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton was signed, in which England formally recognised Scotland as an independent kingdom and Bruce as its rightful king. This marked the first time that England legally acknowledged Scotland's sovereignty. Bruce had finally won the war that he had been fighting for over 2 decades. By this time, however, Bruce's health was failing. He may have suffered from leprosy, but this is also suggested to be a possible propaganda piece by his enemies. His skull, which might also be King David I's, shows no sign of leprosy. Reconstructions of Bruce show a broad face with a striking nose. Despite his illness, he remained active in governance, ensuring that Scotland remained strong after his passing. In his final act of devotion, he requested that his heart be taken on crusade to the Holy Land. Sir Walter and Sir Robert of Clan Logan, the clan I'm related to, were also present. The clan symbol is a heart with a nail through it, which is Bruce's own heart. Though Bruce never made the journey himself, his close ally Sir James Douglas carried Bruce's heart in a silver casket. They were ambushed by Moors and Douglas was killed in battle in Spain. Bruce's heart was later returned to Melrose Abbey, where it was buried. This was a strategic decision of faith, so that 2 sets of prayers would be said by monks. One set by the monks at Dunfermline Abbey and the other set by the monks at Melrose, and this would reduce the time that the king would spend in purgatory. The king himself may have been worried about any sins that he committed during his lifetime. His heart has actually been excavated twice. The first time in 1921, and it was taken to Edinburgh and it was photographed, placed in a new canister and then reburied. The second time, in 1996, they opened the 1921 casket, finding the original inside and a commemorative note. Rather than opening the original casket again, they utilised an endoscope to look inside at the heart, which was described as being prune-like. While archaeologists cannot confirm for certain that it is Bruce's heart, as there's 2 other heart burials recorded at Melrose, the records of Bruce's heart being buried at Melrose have resulted in it being assigned to him. Alongside this, to preserve it, it was soaked in hot tar, cooking it and meaning that there is no DNA to be extracted. Nevertheless, the heart was reburied at Melrose, and the heart marker is still there to see today. Bruce died on the 7th of June 1329, leaving behind a legacy of resilience, strategic brilliance and leadership. His son David II inherited the throne, though Scotland's struggles with England and the Balliols would continue for years, though that's a story for another day. Today, Robert the Bruce remains a national icon. His victories, his leadership and his undying determination shaped Scotland's destiny. Bruce was not a perfect man, ruthless and pragmatic, and only a nationalist and a patriot when it suited him and moved him towards his goal of kingship. But he was the man that Scotland needed to become an independent medieval kingdom. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. If you haven't already done so, please do subscribe. And if you'd like to support me further, I have links to my Patreon and Ko-fi accounts in the link tree in the description. I hope you'll join me again soon for another journey into history. Until next time though, keep learning and thank you very much. received his right leg, and according to some sources, his genitals were hung... Hi, I need you to go out, please. Ba-ba-da-ba. And instead, many of them decided to ally with France to resist the English clown. That's a bit of a Freudian slip there.